So, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar, What is at Stake at COP27. This is Kadir Lavadens speaking from Bolivia. Send you greetings from the altitudes in La Paz, Bolivia. I'm the global coordinator for DCJ. So, to begin with, each COP has its own particular context. Our world is going through incredible challenges in all fronts: pandemic, armed conflicts in many parts of the world, biodiversity loss and destruction at unprecedented rates, and of course, climate change exacerbating all problems and causing new ones. As climate justice movements, the urgency for deep structural changes seems more evident than ever, despite those who are not only blind to our crisis, but look after their own interests. A COP sponsored by Coca-Cola and with an outraging participation of those who have caused the problem. In this webinar, we will take a look at what is at stake at this new COP and what is the role of the climate justice movement. With no further delay, I want to welcome our first panelist, an incredibly experienced woman, and I will ask Meena to introduce herself for those who do not know her yet, while we prepare, we make sure that the presentation is ready. So please, Meena, go ahead.
Well, I don't know what to say, whether it's good morning, good evening, good night. I'm coming from Malaysia in Penang, where it's 10:08 in the evening. So apologies that that you may not be able to see me. So clearly it's quite dark around where I am. I am from Third World Network, and I'm also with Friends of the Earth Malaysia and member of Friends of the Earth International. I don't think I want to say more than that. I think I've one of the, I think, longest people ever followed all the COPs, and we've written a book about it in terms of all the fights and the struggles. So I'm very happy to be invited to speak. Shall I just proceed, Gadir? Okay.
Yes, please.
I've prepared a not so exciting slide, but this is also to guide the translation. And I wasn't quite sure to what extent people on the call on this webinar are aware of some of the decisions that were taken. So apologies for those of you who have already are familiar with these issues, but I think that it's important to actually get all of us on the same page. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? So it looks like there is a little bit of a lag here. Yeah, I'm sorry it's all cramped here, but I just wanted to, no, that's fine. Yeah, the Glasgow outcomes at last year's COP. So before we carry on to talk about what's going to happen or what's at stake in COP27 in Egypt, I think it's really very important for us to understand what went on in Glasgow, where the overall narrative of false solutions for the Great Escape and carbon colonialism actually happened. Many of my colleagues will probably be dealing with in greater detail what I will do today, and I'm sure they will take it forward in terms of much more depth. So what I intend to do is actually to highlight some of the main things. Now, for 2 years, because of the lack of a meeting due to the COVID pandemic, the UK presidency generally had 2 years to prepare the overall narrative. And there was this pressure of pretense of keeping 1.5 degree centigrade alive with the charade of net zero targets for all by 2050, with carbon markets and offsets in nature-based solutions, all of which we were opposed to, but except for the 1.5 degree limit, of course. But all these false solutions were actually legitimized at COP26. Now, there was the myth of saving the planet was secured with the false solutions. And this is really a big con. I'm sure my comrade Rachel Rose will talk about this, Doreen as well in greater detail. So I won't go much into this. So the Glasgow Climate Pact, they call it the GCP, was seen as being more important than the Paris Agreement. Actually, it was, the Paris Agreement is a legal instrument The Glasgow Climate Pact is a decision which is supposed to advance the Paris Agreement. Many of us don't like the Paris Agreement, but despite that, if you look at the Glasgow Climate Pact, it even weakened what's there in the Paris Agreement through actually a dilution of the responsibilities of developed countries. So meeting the emissions gap between the temperature limit and the NDCs, which is the nationally determined contributions that parties have communicated under the Paris Agreement, without differentiation. So this agenda of common and shared responsibilities instead of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. If you look at the decision text, you will find all parties taking into account national circumstances. All of this was basically weakening equity. And for us, it's very important to understand that equity is very, very key internationally. Of course, intra-national equity as well, but North-South equity, very critical. But here, there was no recognition of fair shares. That means, how do you fairly distribute the atmospheric space or the remaining carbon budget? No historical responsibility in cumulative emissions of past and present by the developed countries. Focus only on future emissions with no account of consumption emissions. So there was this pretense of ambition in the phase out and phase down of fossil fuels. Many of you know that this was hailed as the biggest outcome, but the focus was on unabated coal, fossil fuel subsidies, which also is supposed to be some mention. So first time mention of coal and fossil fuel subsidies, but there was a lot of qualifiers in there, and there's no differentiation. And in actual reality, with all this pretense, there's actual expansion in fossil fuel extraction and production in the north. And even today, because of the Ukraine crisis, even the most environmental champion like Germany have gone back on this, and they are now going into coal production. So everything that we from the pretense and the little that they promised to do, we are all going backwards. And this is, as Gadir had said, is really a really frightening situation at this moment. So in Glasgow, there was strong US pressure with US leadership, in inverted commas that I put, and the UK presidency was complicit with the US to enable a deal. And this I will talk about later, particularly in relation to loss and damage. And the G77 basically united on many things, which is the group of countries, of developing countries negotiating under this big bloc. They were disunited over the mitigation approach, and they were disunited over carbon markets. So there was actually no international cooperation, but actually competition. And in the current climate, multilateralism is actually very weak. In fact, it is much more about competition and combat. And the intention to introduce carbon border measures, which is actually not ambitious at all, because it's actually punishing developing countries even further. And the no relaxation of intellectual property, as you saw, even in the case of the pandemic, where the COVID vaccines were inaccessible to developing countries, the poor, the people who were sick and who were dying, and there was no relaxation of intellectual property to benefit the big pharmaceuticals. Next, please. So taking on from that, in adaptation, what was important from the Glasgow outcome was there was actually in Paris a call for a concrete process on the global goal on adaptation, because we have a 1.5 degree limit temperature goal. Of course, it says 2 degrees, but with a pursuit of 1.5 degrees C compared to pre-industrial levels. But on adaptation, there was also a need for a goal. Developing countries were fighting hard for this. And that goal is to enhance the adaptive capacity, to strengthen resilience and reduce vulnerability, to contribute to sustainable development, and to ensure adequate response to the temperature goal. The idea here was basically that to elaborate on how we would actually look at the progress in terms of a goal on adaptation. So the outcome in Glasgow was a 2-year work program, which was called the Sharm El-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation. And the work actually began in the subsidiary bodies meeting in 2022. So in Glasgow, in Sharm El-Sheikh, I'll come to it in a little while to see whether what will actually go forward. And then also it was agreed that developed countries were urged, it not even committed to. It was merely an urging to at least double their collective provision of climate finance for adaptation from 2019 onwards, 2019 levels by to 2025. Very, very little. It's only about doubling. And the context of achieving a balance between mitigation and adaptation for scaled up financial resources. I'll come to this again. So this is actually very little out of finance for adaptation in Glasgow. Next. Then we come to loss and damage. Many of you know this, that the additional finance from developed countries and effective mechanism and approaches for loss and damage action and support. This was a very big call by the Group of 77 in China, but the outcome was no additional finance. Instead of calls for a finance facility for loss and damage, there was a Glasgow dialogue which was established, primarily because of the United States, which said that we will not have any mechanism for addressing for financial facility. We will not talk about finance for loss and damage, not even a facility for that. So you can forget about any commitment on this. It's merely a dialogue. That's all they agreed to. Then there's this other thing called the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, which is a technical assistance body to help developing countries who need technical assistance on loss and damage. Next slide, please. So the mitigation ambition where in Glasgow with no ambition on finance. So I won't read the whole thing, but there was this reaffirmation, and then there's recognizing that the limit to global warming to 1.5 degrees C requires rapid, deep, sustained reductions in GHG emissions, including reducing global carbon dioxide emissions by 45% by 2030 relative to 2010 and to net zero around mid-century. And no differentiation here. And then if you actually look at it, this was the only thing which was really about a decision to establish a work program to urgently scale up mitigation ambition. But there is no commensurate responsibility to actually ensure that the mitigation ambition is linked to a finance ambition. Now, this is why the developing countries were calling for this process to complement the global stocktake. For those of you who know this, under the Paris Agreement in next year, we are supposed to take stock of how the parties have progressed on meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement on all fronts: mitigation, adaptation, finance, and even on to look at how loss and damage is being treated. So in this case, what they are saying is that you cannot just have mitigation ambition without looking at finance. But the developed countries were very mitigation centric, and this was really the problem. Next, please. And then we have the controversial coal para. If you remember, this was this big in the news media, where there was actually a phase down of unabated coal power and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. And then this language, which was added by India and China on the last hours, while providing targeted support to the poorest and most vulnerable in line with their national circumstances, and recognizing the need for support towards a just transition. We'll talk about this further, but these are some aspects which are very important in terms of how do you actually address the energy poverty and how do you actually ensure there is just transition. And this actually, a lot of that language came from the G20 Rome Summit. Next, please. Just very quickly on the mitigation side, many of you already know this, the 50% probability of limiting temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. What you have is a 2,956 gigatons of carbon dioxide for that temperature limit. What you actually see remaining is only 17%. 83% has already been consumed, largely by the developed world. So you actually see that there's very little carbon space left. And as the Ipcc has shown, with 42 gigatons of carbon being released every year, in this decade, we would have exhausted this carbon budget. And we are already at 1.1 degree temperature rise now currently. Next, please. there's a table just to show you the difference between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1, where you can see basically the inequity, the share of global population. As we all know, the North has, with a small population, is consuming much of these resources on a per capita basis, taking into account historical emissions. Next, please. So for the next slide. So some of the big issues at COP27 in Sharm El-Sheikh, this will be the main issues. Mitigation work program, what will it be? Because we agreed in Glasgow there would be a mitigation program. So what will that look like? The global goal on adaptation, are we able to elaborate that further? The Santiago network on loss and damage, will it be operational with funding? Will there be willingness to put loss and damage on the COP agenda and for negotiations on a finance facility? Because this is actually what is being, there's a big fight now, whether to even have loss and damage on the COP agenda itself, because the US is against it, but the G77 pushed for it. So we will have an agenda fight on that. Then, will there be any real delivery of the 100 billion per year finance, which was promised in Copenhagen and in Cancun in 2010? Will that really be any delivery at all? And then there is this new collective goal on finance. Will the needs of developing countries be reflected in the note that is being prepared? So this is very important. I'll come to that in a little while. And the global stocktake, this is already happening in terms of the dialogues in order to have an assessment of the global stocktake next year. So we will see whether what kind of reflections will be there, whether it is actually a correct assessment of the kind of progress that has happened or lack of progress, as the case may be. Next, please. So the mitigation work program, and these are some of what I think the global campaign to demand climate justice should be focusing on. We need to support the equitable access to atmospheric space as a discussion on equity and the fair shares approach. Some of the countries, developing countries, some in the like-minded, for instance, Bolivia and others who are advancing this. They have been advancing this ever since, even in Paris, but it never got any traction. But if you do not have a fair shares approach, you will have an unfair, unjust, and you cannot actually reach the temperature goal. And all these NDCs of particularly the developed world is doing too little, too late, and worse if you have net zero by 2050, which is really, really too late. And then the fossil fuel phase out, especially in developed countries, this is critical for us to demand. And in developing countries, a just transition for developing countries. And as a call for keeping fossils in the ground in developing countries, it will require required finance to address the energy poverty through alternatives, ensure energy democracy, and so on. I'm sure many of you have better suggestions, and we already have this in the global campaign to demand climate justice demands from before. So we could use some of this to make this case. And what's particularly important is that the developed countries are backtracking, and we cannot allow that. Next, please. Article 6, I'm sure other of my colleagues will deal with this, but I just wanted to flag, this will still be an issue in Sharm El-Sheikh. This is market and non-market mechanisms. There is a good decision called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is on non-market approaches. It was championed by Bolivia and supported by the like-minded developing countries. So this we need to support, and Sarparna and others can talk more about this. It's a good way of matching actions with financial support or other support that is needed for developing countries. Article 6.2 and 6.4 have opened the door for emissions trading, and we need to strongly denounce carbon markets as a false solution. And also we need to, there's a huge concern that there are some proposals for carbon capture and storage, BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture, and so on. A lot of false solutions being proposed, including carbon dioxide removals, geoengineering solutions. So we must not allow such mechanisms to get in under the Article 6. Next, please. So the reparations for climate justice, and this is the finance part, the payment of the climate debt and the ecological debt that we have to look at through history, the scale of what's needed in the developing world, is much larger than the promises that is made. The 100 billion is per year is actually peanuts, but even then it's not based on the needs of developing countries. It was a political promise which has not been kept, and it was extended to fulfillment by 2025. So this is really very little. And just as a information, the Green Climate Fund, which is a fund that developing countries had called for, which is set up in Songdo in South Korea, the 10 billion, which was the initial resource mobilization, Obama had promised 3 billion, but only 1 billion was committed, and the 2 billion was not honored by the Trump administration. So the US still has a shortfall, and the first formal replenishment was only around $9.7 billion. This is a dedicated fund for climate. Now, as of now, $10.8 billion has been committed. And according to one report by the Hendrik Boll Foundation, since its inception in 2014, only $13.9 billion has been delivered. So very little has gone to the Green Climate Fund. And what is even more alarming, at currently in the Green Climate Fund, no funds are there to fund the remaining projects. So this is really shocking. As we are going towards Sharm El-Sheikh, we have no money in the Green Climate Fund to fund projects. This looks really bad. And then there's a second replenishment period that has just started, process that has just started. Now, another fund which is very critical is the Adaptation Fund, dedicated for adaptation. It's also a Kyoto Protocol fund under the UNFCCC. Since it started operations in 2007, less than $1.5 billion has been saved. So it's very, very little of money which has really gone into these funds so far. And then if you look at on the right side, the new collective quantified goal on finance, which was agreed to by 2024 for the new finance goal, is supposed to be based on the needs of developing countries. And according to the needs determination report, which is out, $5 to $11 trillion are needed based on developing country needs. And based on these reports, only 30% has been costed, and that too for mitigation mainly. So you see that even the 5 to 11 trillion is also a small amount compared to what is actually needed. And if you look at the latest Ipcc estimates for adaptation, 400 billion in annual cost by 2030 to $1 trillion by 2050. And this is for adaptation. Yeah, this is from Ipcc. I skipped the UNEP adaptation gap report because that's a little later, but just to give you a flavor. And in terms of loss and damage, one study in 2018, it's projected the cost to be around 290 billion and 580 billion for economic losses for loss and damage in developing countries. And most recently, of course, if we look at the Pakistan disaster, it affected 13 million people and cost $30 billion in damage. So we are really in the realm of huge amounts of money for huge disasters which are happening. Next slide, please. So the scale is really, really massive. So this is a very important slide that we are connecting the debt justice and the climate justice together, because we have to demand this, because in the world today, the financial debt crisis is growing. Sorry, I'm hearing some background noise. The financial debt crisis is growing across the global south, affecting the ability of governments to act on public health, alleviate poverty, undertake climate actions, including adapt to climate change, and to go low carbon. Now, 40 countries are in serious debt in developing countries already. The global north also owes an ecological and economic debts, and this, the global political order and climate crisis itself was built by colonialism and slavery, and emissions caused by the Industrial Revolution. So you can see that the debt justice and the climate justice are so interconnected. And so the historical and ongoing plunder of an extraction of natural resources, the global south also, and also responsible for climate and environmental pollution, both from production systems and consumption patterns, all of which are driving the debt crisis as well. So on the demand side, we have to call for debt cancellation as part of reparations. There's also now a focus on progressive redistribution.
Sorry to
finishing.
interrupt you.
I'm finishing.
No. I'm saying that if you can speak a little bit slower for
Oh
the
God,
interpreters.
I'm very worried about the time. Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So apologies for that. So we do need to link the debt justice and the climate justice together. So among the demands we must make, given the current state of the problem, debt cancellation as part of reparations, progressive redistribution of International Monetary Fund special drawing rights, which is grant-based, no conditionalities, and channeled via the UNFCCC funding entities. Just to pause here on special drawing rights, why we are saying this is because if you remember, because of the COVID pandemic, the International Monetary Fund actually last year issued $650 billion of special drawing rights. And this largely went to the rich developed world, because the way the IMF works, it's according to how much money countries put into the IMF. So the more you put, the more money you get back. So this is what happened. So in other words, the poorer countries and the indebted countries that actually need this money did not get that money. So it is possible to rechannel these into the for climate and for debt purposes. In fact, there is just a new paper report delivered by UNCTAD, which is the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and they are also calling for this. And also some 7 to 8 international organizations have just issued a letter and a news release which has come out also calling for this. And the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley in Glasgow, was very powerful as a voice of particularly the island states. She called for $500 billion annually in special drawing rights to be issued to finance the energy transition in developing countries and limit temperature rise. I would also make the case for adaptation and even some amount of money for loss and damage, of course. Now, increasing loans to developing countries to address climate change is untenable. You can't be having particularly debt-distressed countries to take on more loans. This is not climate justice, it's climate injustice. But just to look at another source of money apart from the special drawing rights, if you look at fossil fuel subsidies, according to ODI, which is an international, it's a northern group, the G7 countries provide at least 100 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies. So they can very easily remove those fossil fuel subsidies and channel it for climate finance. Next slide, please. I think I may have come to the end of my slides. Oh, sorry, adaptation. So what we need on adaptation, increase financing for adaptation, very critical. Not just the doubling, we should ask for more, as I have indicated. And the real progress on elaborating the global goal and adaptation. I'm not going to go into the details. I've already talked about that, what the elements of that are, and how we want to actually see real ways of assessing progress on how the world is measuring progress on enhancing capacity, adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, reducing vulnerability, and so on. In fact, some of us are saying that we should actually have resilience and reparations as a major theme. So resilience and reparations, very, very key. I think the DCJ can go with that big message. Next, please. On loss and damage, finance facility and finance for loss and damage, a very critical demand, and the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage to be made operational through agreement on its institutional arrangements, consistent with developing countries' needs and priorities, with funding arrangements for developing countries' loss and damage in place. A very important outcome if we get that outcome. Next slide. I think that is my last slide. So for further information, you can contact me. Now we can go back to the main frame. So yeah, we will share these slides, but that's the big picture of where we will go from Glasgow to Sharm El-Sheikh. I hope I apart from being too fast, I apologize, but I hope it has been useful.
Thank you. so much, Meena. We did go over the time, but it didn't make any sense for me to stop you for providing us and sharing all that information that is so vital at this point in time. And thank you for sharing. I want to highlight that what Meena shared, all the points she shared, is through a lens of climate justice. And it's important to reiterate that, because that concept of climate justice was a fight, a struggle of many years that has happened through all of you, many of you that are here, and through all the movements on the ground that have created this concept. And we cannot let, first of all, whoever to just take it and destroy it, but secondly, we need to re-emphasize that it is not just about some emissions there. It is connected to something more structural. Thank you very much, Meena. I reiterate that Meena cannot stay longer, but if you have any questions or anything you would like to address with her, you can do it via the chat. So if she can say something.
I can stay a little bit. So let's see. Yeah, but if there are questions, I can answer on the chat.
Yeah, let's use the chat then. That's good that you can stay some minutes or some time that you can interact with her via the chat. Although doing a double concentration, we will go to our next panelists who are, well, as well, incredible colleagues and friends who have also very useful information to share with us in this context of the COP. So we have Rachel, Rose, and Suparna, and I understand Suparna will go first. Please introduce yourself a little bit before you speak so people can get to know you. And I will ask our next panelists, though, to stick to the time assigned, because we want all of you to be heard and to share your information, please. Thank you. Go ahead. Go ahead, Suparna.
Thanks, Nadir. So I'm Shopon Lahiri from Global Forest Coalition. I'm also associated with Climate Land Ambition Rights Alliance, and of course, Demand for Climate Justice. Thanks a lot, Meena, cutting what, so we don't have to go back to Glasgow and Paris Agreement and elsewhere, and so don't have to spend all that time. But looking at COP27, and so why it's called, the webinar is What's at Stake, COP27. I would say that where, as Meena indicated, that climate finance as part of fair share, equity, and common but differentiated approach, top of it, the obligations that they are still to, the global north are still to actually operationalize their obligation. What is happening now is that developing countries, the vulnerable countries, are really starved of climate finance. And on top of it, the demand for finance, separate funding facility for loss and damage, they are now peddling to us in the garb of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which got a stamp in Glasgow, and is infamous, I would say, somewhat as the articles which promote carbon markets, carbon trading, offsets, and what also Meena has referred to could lead to carbon colonialism. But so they're trying to peddle this in order to peddle false solutions, as we see. And at this point of time, I would say which ones we should say are false solutions. Everybody knows that from the Ipcc reports of the AR6, it's very clear that to keep below 1.5, we need to reduce our emissions by around 50% by 2030. There is no two-way in that. If we don't do that, we are going to overshoot 1.5. Second is the carbon budget that we are left with, which Meena has already touched. And that doesn't allow us any more room to talk of offsets. Now, offsets, when you hear it, what are offset, it seems that at one place you are reducing emissions, while at the other end, someone is buying credit, carbon credit from those emissions to continue emitting, which means that there is a false equivalence being created, but actually the emission reduction is not happening. So at this point of time, when we go to Sharm El-Sheikh, our point is any climate solution which does not result in reduction of carbon emission will be false solutions and are false solutions. If you say why afforestation, reforestation, yes, tree planting, which is now basically done through monoculture plantations. This lead to deforestation, number one. This can destroy our biodiversity, reduce water table, doesn't provide livelihood to communities. These are mostly invasive single species, trees, and it doesn't lead to any kind of climate solution, any kind of reduction of carbon. Second, when you hear of REDD+, originally was for reducing emission. So if you stop deforestation immediately, you can reduce emission, but don't talk of a project or a scheme which talks of reduction, stopping the deforestation at a future date, which we call avoiding emission. That is not emission reduction. And then, of course, offsets, which are coming in various ways. Even today, the renewable energy projects are being used to create offsets and carbon credits. These are not reduction of carbon emissions. So what has happened, what has turned this thing in is actually the Article 6. If you go to the Article 6 text, even in terms of 6.1 to 6.7, you won't find the use of the term which leads to carbon market, carbon trading, offsets. At the best, 6.2 has something like international, international cooperation on climate mitigation options. So this was actually an article which basically talked of raising ambitions through real climate actions, through international cooperation. But the developed North and the corporates have completely turned this text into a negotiation kind of a thing since 2016 till Glasgow, where they have created a mechanism of carbon trading, international trading in emissions, creating offsets, which I'm again saying are all false solutions. And in the process, they have actually marginalized one of the important para in that Article 6, which is 6.8. And we call it a non-market approach to international cooperation. So 6.8 by the text, if you go by the text, is very clear. It's an international cooperation towards real solution through adaptation and joint adaptation and mitigation approach. It's a very simple mechanism, no double counting, no accounting procedure, no complex rules. And it can benefit the communities, the indigenous people, women who are in the forefront, the vulnerable communities, the frontline communities who are in the forefront of fighting climate, of providing real climate solutions, climate resilience. They will get direct finance to fight this climate crisis. And that's why this 6.8 has been marginalized. And even after Glasgow, we saw in Bonn how the US, Canada, Japan, and EU have tried to block any progress on operationalization of 6.8 under the non-market approach by COP27. So when we look at Africa, we see real climate and carbon colonialism unfolding for a time there. Even today, if you are talking of producing natural gas instead of oil, is a false solution. If you see Gabon, what is Gabon doing? The second largest forested country in Africa with 85% forest cover is talking of producing carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market. Why do they need that? And the whole of Africa, if you go to Uganda, Kenya, Mozambique, in South Africa, either they're flooded by monoculture plantations or they're flooded by forest carbon offset projects, which doesn't, the benefit of it doesn't reach the communities. It doesn't provide a livelihood, and it has huge impact not only on the IPLCs, but women. Women are in the forefront everywhere of biodiversity and forest conservation, and they still lead. If you think of agroecology as a real solution, women are everywhere in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, are in the forefront of agroecological farming. And so that is not a, that is what these people are trying to block, create a barrier towards real solutions and real zero. And they're trying to create a horde of false solutions, which are not real solutions. They do not reduce carbon. And the kind of, it's a delaying tactics towards real solutions and real zero. But why is it happening? It's not only the countries of the developed north, but probably the corporate, how the corporates, are coming into the picture, taking over the global policy on climate change. And perhaps going into Sharm El-Sheikh, we will see more naked truth in how corporates are going to take over the COP27 negotiations there. And we have already got inkling from what is going on in Bonn right now on the negotiations for Article 6 in COP27. I would leave here and I'll ask Rachel Rose to follow up.
Thank you, Suparna. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Rose Jackson from Corporate Accountability, a DCJ member. It's wonderful to see many friends and some new names for me joining us today. As Suparna just shared the story of how Article 6, a piece of the Paris Agreement that was initially meant to be about global collaboration to decrease emissions, to keep global temperature to below 1.5 degrees Celsius, somehow became a totally different vehicle that is now at the heart of the Paris Agreement and being used to undermine and weaken any chance we have at a strong and just response to climate change. And the reason behind this co-optation of Article 6 and the story that Suparna shared, as well as the reason behind all the other failures that Meena just mentioned within the UNFCCC, is the same reason that the UNFCCC has failed for 30 years, year after year after year, to deliver meaningful and just climate action. And that reason is corporate capture. We are not on the brink of extinction by accident. Communities across the global south and across the front lines of the climate crisis are not paying with their lives and livelihoods and loss of culture and homeland and communities by accident. We are here on the brink of societal and collapse and environmental collapse because big polluters have bought, paid for, manipulated, undermined in lockstep with global north countries every meaningful attempt to justly and urgently address the climate crisis through the UNFCCC as its main arena of instruction, but also through every other multilateral institution and international platform possible. As a result of this corporate capture, the UNFCCC, as well as other multilateral institutions, have been co-opted by big polluters and by global north countries who are most responsible for emissions to date, not as a way to advance just people-centered collaboration to solve global problems, but instead as a way to preserve elitism, colonialism, extractivism, and sexism. And each COP, as the stranglehold of big polluters over climate policy gets greater and greater, this disease of corporate capture gets more and more insidious, not less so. And this is why we're headed to COP27 already knowing that this COP is going to fail, despite the fact that we have all of the money needed available in the world to justly address the climate crisis. COVID is one example of that. The war in Ukraine and the aid that was mobilized overnight is another example of that. Not to say that either of those responses were done justly or carried out correctly, but they prove that mega mobilization of mass finance, billions upon trillions of dollars, is possible overnight. We also have the solutions that we need to address the climate crisis. Not these dangerous distractions that Suparna is naming, like carbon markets, offset mechanisms, BECS, geoengineering, which we'll hear more about from some of our comrades later. We have the real and proven solutions at the ready in order to be able to justly transition off of fossil fuels, to support and regenerate our communities and ecosystems, and to have a planet that's thriving. We also have the urgency as we're crossing environmental tipping points on a daily basis. And as many of you probably know and are likely living climate impacts on a daily basis. And we have the science to prove that all of this is needed and possible. But because big polluters have been able to buy, control, manipulate, and unduly influence climate policy from day one, here we are fighting for our very existence, and people on the front lines are losing their lives and livelihoods by the day. Big polluters use a variety of strategies in order to undermine the global response to climate change. They spend billions of dollars every year on lobbying nationally and internationally to undermine any meaningful attempt to address climate change. I read this morning that the top oil and gas companies alone spent almost $12.5 million on lobbying only in the first quarter of this year. And that was already about a $1 million increase than this time last year. So at this very moment where existence is at stake, they're ramping up their attempt to continue to be able to pollute and profit, to pillage and plunder frontline communities and ecosystems, all to make a couple extra bucks before, the ship goes down. Big polluters also make extensive political contributions across all countries where they operate, and in countries in the global south where they're trying to manipulate, which has the effect of leaving these politicians in debt to the industry and its will. They also seek and advance strategies to promote weak and voluntary commitments or platforms or initiatives in order to avoid the need for binding regulation. And Article 6 is a perfect example of this, because instead of discussing binding requirements and legal requirements for global north countries to provide the finance, the technology, and the solutions and the collaboration needed to actually address the climate crisis, governments are discussing how to ramp up dangerous and planet and people damning carbon market schemes in order to be able to pretend to be seen to take action while continuing to pollute and send the world, soaring way past 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. These corporations lobby directly and indirectly through their trade associations and front groups that are also allowed to participate unrestricted in climate negotiations, and therefore have direct access to world leaders and governments and the policymaking table where the world's response to climate change is dictated. And then outside the UNFCCC and in other UN institutions, they also co-opt science by undermining sound science, but also promoting and funding misleading science and occupying academia as well, so that they're increasingly shape-shifting a scientific foundation that serves their agenda, false though that foundation is. They also buy political goodwill and influence by offering technical assistance to governance, or in the case of COP27, sponsoring the COPs themselves. The COPs are literally bought and paid for by corporations, and usually polluting corporations. Just in the past weeks, it was announced that that Microsoft, which is the world's largest tech sponsor or partner of the fossil fuel industry, is one of the principal partners of COP27. So you have a corporation that's enabling, and not just enabling, but supporting and profiting off of the continuation of fossil fuel use on a daily basis, sponsoring the very talks meant to, or that need to help us justly transition off fossil fuels. And as many of you probably heard last week, Coca-Cola was announced as another COP sponsor. The world's largest plastics polluter and major abuser of people and the planet is allowed to put the UNFCCC branding and logo all over its PR scheming and dreaming and bullying, and it's extraordinary. These talks have completely been bought and manipulated and now are twisted to serve the interests of the very polluters whom they need to regulate and hold liable. And as Meena shared in her introductory overview, you know, what do we have to show for this corporate capture? Well, for as long as the UNFCCC existed, we've constantly had weakened and undermined attempts. We have a Kyoto Protocol that is essentially dead and buried. We have a Paris Agreement that was significantly weakened to be as meaningless as possible and toothless as possible. And now, even those couple of things that were in the Paris Agreement, like a recognition of equity and fairness, as Meena said, like the recognition of common but differentiated responsibilities, at COP27, we even risk having that ripped up and lit on fire through the mitigation work program, which Meena spoke about, through the rewriting of equity and removing it from climate policy, through Article 6 obstruction, which Suparna talked about. And now we have a global climate action regime that relies almost entirely on false solutions as the bedrock, because this preserves the status quo, not just of corporations, but of the political elite, of the very governments who have profited off of fossil fuel run economies on the backs of those in the global south and frontline communities. But I will end this section on a bit of a positive note. There are thousands and millions of us around the world who are uniting behind a call to end corporate capture of climate policy, to refuse to accept a system that is being allowed to be bought to serve polluters and not the people. And just a couple of months ago, earlier this summer, 5 UNFCCC constituencies representing thousands of groups around the world and millions of people jointly put forward a position on the need for an accountability framework at the UNFCCC to end big polluters' interference. I won't walk you through it because there's so many other exciting things to hear from others right now, but I hope that you take a look. And on the movement side, there's a global campaign called Kick Big Polluters Out that many of us are part of, and hundreds of others who aren't here, who are currently campaigning and demanding that world governments finally head to COP27 and end the corporate capture of these talks, calling for a reset of the system. No more big polluter writing the rules, no more big polluters bankrolling climate action. It's time for polluters out, peoples in, and a system change that works for people and advances real solutions and restores the planet. Just today, this coalition is launching a sign-on, and we're hoping to have thousands of us united in demanding an end to corporate capture at COP27. So I've popped the sign-on in the chat. Please circulate, please join, send to all of your networks. Let's be resilient and strong and powerful, and refuse to accept a system that's working for big polluters, not the people. I think, though, all of this begs the question, what are some of the false solutions we're expecting to see advanced at COP27? Suparna, you kind of already spoke about that, so I don't know if there's anything quickly you want to mention there before I talk a bit more about this overall political agenda that's bringing all of these false solutions together.
I just want to end on my portion end on a very positive note. As we all know, precursor to real solutions, community-driven real solutions, is decolonization of the land sector policies and legislations. which means that tenure rights, access to land, to communities and especially women, community governance of land sector is what we need as a precursor and to facilitate real solutions. And I would say that we should counter this whole issue of false solutions being peddled in the next COP. The whole going back on equity, fair share, and climate finance is that we should turn the tide and from them to us, to see that the next COP in Sharm El-Sheikh is a COP which is a real solution, real zero COP. Nothing less, nothing short than that. Rachel?
Thanks, Suparna. Yeah, as Suparna shared, we need a real zero COP that advances real solutions, serving real people, not corporations who are the very reason for this crisis. And the first step in demanding a real zero COP is challenging what is a net zero COP, or this net zero agenda. Increasingly, this concept of net zero is being misconstrued in political spaces, including the UNFCCC, to evade action and avoid responsibility for the climate crisis. And this whole concept of net zero kind of breaks down to the idea that an entity, whether it's a corporation or a polluting government, can continue to pollute as usual, or, as we're increasingly seeing, even increase its emissions and seek to somehow compensate for those emissions by shifting the burden of action onto communities and countries in the global south. But these emissions reductions programs or offsets or carbon markets, whatever they're called, they're nothing more than a math equation in these plans. It sounds very simple, but they're deeply flawed. Big polluters and polluting wealthy countries like the US, got regions like the EU, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, are using this net zero political agenda to follow a similar pattern of carbon colonialism, of historic domination, of attempting to pamper over neocolonialism by using this language of environmental sustainability, but all while orchestrating their great escape from climate action while condemning people and the planet to death and destruction. There's a report that many of us produced last year called The Big Con, which I can put the link for in the chat. But it's a really great report that breaks down all of the ways that big polluters are using this net zero agenda to advance a deadly and dangerous climate agenda. And not just the ways that they're using this net zero agenda, but the strategies that they've actually used to orchestrate this agenda. They are the ones behind this net zero political agenda. They are the ones that have invested millions and millions of dollars in shaping an academic foundation to justify their version of net zero, in buying political will through billions of dollars of contributions at national level legislations and governments to advance net zero friendly policies instead of meaningful and real policies. And they also using their net zero plans or this net zero agenda to completely avoid and sidestep the need for any real and meaningful action. But as this report breaks down, there are at least 8 fundamental failings with these net zero plans and this net zero agenda. First of all, they're too vague to mean anything. These plans and this agenda systematically fails to detail any concrete plans to actually decrease emissions at source, which we know we have to do in order to have any chance at keeping global temperature rise to below 1.5. This net zero agenda also disguises the intent to wrap up emissions intensive production, not to decrease it. It relies on all of the dangerous distractions and false solutions that Suparna just shared about, not real solutions, which we know are absolutely needed not only to decrease global temperature rise and curb it, but also to advance social justice, gender justice, to end colonialism and racism within our systems. This net zero agenda is completely ignorant of science and logic. It has no credible science and data to suggest.
Slow down a little bit.
Sorry, yes. Sorry, everyone. These plans have no scientific foundation that's credible to rely upon. They rely on fabricated and manipulated science. And they also rely on impossible math. All of these plans rely on this net zero agenda relies on a simple strategy, dangerous strategy of intending to continue to pollute while using offset schemes to try to compensate for this continued pollution. But in order to, there simply isn't enough land on planet Earth. We would need multiple planet Earths to ever be able to offset enough emissions for the continued production of fossil fuels and other emissions intensive products that the world and world governments and polluters are currently planning for. So ultimately, this agenda puts profit over people on the planet, and it's a total rejection of the systemic change that we know we need urgently and yesterday. So net zero is not even a politically independent concept. The strategy, corporations have advanced strategies to manipulate, plant, and shape this global agenda to serve their greed. And in addition to the things that are happening within COP27, which Meena and Suparna spoke about, the big polluters are also pulling the strings behind many initiatives that are advancing this agenda, including things like the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, the high-level expert group on the net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, Race to Zero. Many of these things are even UN-backed and promoted, but at their core, there are big polluters manipulating, shaping, seeding their agenda through these initiatives. Instead, we need, as Suparna said, a bedrock of community-led solutions that we know work, that are cost-effective, that restore and respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, of women, of frontline communities. At COP27, we need to be demanding a real zero COP, which includes real reductions at source. We need to get to real zero emissions by 2030 at the latest. That needs to start with global North countries who are most responsible, leading the way, not everybody doing everything, as that's completely disrespecting of why we have this crisis to begin with. And in fact, because of this obstruction, we're now beyond the need for real zero. We need to go beyond zero to do everything we possibly can to make up for the lost time that's happened as a result of global North countries, of polluting countries, and of corporations. We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground yesterday, but from tomorrow, and justly transition onto renewable, community-controlled energy sources. We do not have space or time for offset mechanisms, for carbon markets. All of these schemes condemn people and the planet. We need real solutions and this rapid transformation across sectors. There's a wonderful briefing that lays out all of the things that can be done tomorrow if we had the political will to transform our systems. And the beautiful thing about this is that if governments were to wake up tomorrow and finally get serious about realizing this dream of a world where people and the planet can thrive, not big polluters, we would simultaneously address so many crises that exist in our world. From the financial injustice to the debt crises, to racism, systemic racism and gender injustice, to the food crisis and hunger and the energy crisis across Africa and the global South. And we have.
Could we wrap up
yes,
now? Sorry.
2 more sentences. So just to say, we have all of the solutions at the ready. The finance exists, the people power exists. We know that we need a real COP for real solutions for real people. All we need is to demand nothing less than our governments to wake up and to lock in the political wheel and get serious about moving in lockstep with people and not big polluters. So I encourage all of us and invite all of us to imagine what the world would look like if COP27 were to be a real zero COP, and what we can do to help do everything we can to make it so and challenge the injustice where it's happening. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today. And thanks to Parna for being my presentation buddy.
Thank you both for sharing your experience and your knowledge. Every time we hear the facts, it's scary, but as you both mentioned, there's also, together with this, with the outrageousness, there is also hope. And our panelists have also shared material in the chat, opportunities for people in this webinar to get engaged with, so please use them. Also, we reiterate the invitation for those who are connected via Zoom to interact via the chat, because that's not an opportunity others will have when seeing the recording or when interacting through social media. So this is a good opportunity for you to interact among each other and with our panelists. With no further delay, I'd like to invite our next set of panelists that I will address another set of important elements related to COP and the UNFCCC, but also the CBD process, which is the biodiversity linkages with climate. Please, Nikki, introduce yourself, go ahead, and thank you for staying up late for us.
Thanks, Gadir, and thank you to the previous speakers. I'm Nikki, Miranda Martinez. I'm based in the Philippines, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone here. I support the ETC group and also the Hands Off Mother Earth campaign against geoengineering. So ETC group has been following and denouncing geoengineering for more than a decade now. Climate geoengineering refers to proposed large-scale schemes for the deliberate intervention in the Earth's ocean, soil, and atmosphere with the aim of temporarily reducing the effects of climate change. So my presentation today is not about the technologies, but the general overview of some concepts and spaces where we see geoengineering and false solutions within the UNFCCC, and what we can, and of course we can expect to see this appear again during COP27. And just to flag that if anyone here wants to dive deep into geoengineering technologies, please feel free to get in touch with me or my colleague who is here with us today, Saraina Salaki, who coordinates the Hands of Mother Earth campaign. So historical and current high emitting industries, companies and governments have devised various greenwashing strategies to appear concerned about global warming while protecting their investments and avoiding making the needed deep reductions. One main greenwashing instrument, as already shared by Rachel Rose, is the concept of net zero. And on the first bullet here, we have the definition of net zero. And the big polluters that do not want to phase out fossil fuel are appropriating natural ecosystems and other landscapes to lock and trade them as carbon sinks, deploying massive crop and tree plantations and technological geoengineering proposals. So by the UNFCCC COP26, and in the perspective of establishing a new carbon market mechanism through Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, over 2,000 of the largest companies, 130 countries, and hundreds of cities and regions have made net zero pledges. In September 2020, the New Climate reported that 1,541 companies pledged to net zero targets. These companies have a combined revenue of 11.4 trillion US dollars, and they cover 3.5 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions, which is actually greater than India's annual emissions. The photos you see here are just some of the strong civil society resistance against net zero and false solutions in the past year, and it includes the Big Con, spearheaded by Corporate Accountability, Global Forest Coalition, the Friends of the Earth International, and was supported by many CSOs, including ETC Group. So the Ipcc has made it clear that to stop and recover from climate change, there needs to be a drastic reduction of fossil fuels extraction and use before 2030. Right now, there's no more space left in the atmosphere to continue at the current levels or increased levels of greenhouse gas emissions. But again, big polluters claim that there are ways to achieve net zero, and one way is by deploying geoengineering. Geoengineering techniques that's part of the net zero pledges include carbon capture and storage, carbon capture use and storage, direct air capture, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, ocean fertilization, enhanced weathering, and biochar. All these proposed techno-fixes are unproven. They do not address the root causes of climate change. They are used to delay fossil fuel phase out, and they translate to increased greenhouse gas emissions. The development of carbon dioxide removal technologies implies the establishment of new transnational extractive industries. It would deepen unjust patterns of extraction and exploitation of land and resources, both in the global south and in communities impacted by extractive industries in the global north. So there would be devastating impacts on local communities, natural ecosystems, and this includes land grabs, human rights violations, and even sharp increases in food prices. Another greenwashing concept that many of us here have heard of and know about is nature-based solutions or nature-based climate solutions. And this term is intentionally vague and ill-defined to cover as much as possible different measures to appropriate and or manipulate forests, land, coasts, and oceans. It is leading to new corporate grabbing of natural ecosystems such as forests, wetlands, watershed, mangroves, to claim them as carbon sinks that can offset emissions. There are proposals to genetically manipulate crops and trees to absorb more carbon or be more reflective. So this combines the risk of geoengineering with also the risk of genetic manipulation. There are also research projects that aim to genetically engineer the whole soil microbiota to force it to absorb more carbon. Large-scale monoculture plantations and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage are among the false solutions considered for land nature-based solutions. The Ipcc, however, stated in their February 2022 report that proposed methods of carbon dioxide removal, such as BECCS and afforestation, could compromise ecosystem health and food and water security. Two other vast non-conventional carbon sinks that industries and financial markets are pursuing right now to get recognized into the carbon markets are agricultural soils and the oceans. For agricultural land, profiting from carbon offsets requires also the transforming of agriculture into a new carbon farming model. So big digital agribusiness players are stepping forward to offer themselves as the brokers for these highly problematic and unproven soil offsets and the government. So this includes company like Bayer Monsanto and John Deere. The growing digital soil grab ignores the new science on soil carbon sequestration that suggests that soil carbon storage capacity has already been vastly overrated. They do not take into account the high energy cost of the use of digital tools, and they threaten peasant communities and their livelihood. Emerging carbon markets resulting from the negotiations on the implementation of the Paris Agreement have also spurred the push for marine geoengineering technologies, and this includes ocean fertilization and massive plantations of macroalgae or marine forests, which is very similar to monoculture plantations. Ocean fertilization is not permitted under the UN London Convention, and therefore the proponents of this technology have been trying to change what they call these experiments. We have to be aware of the increasing rebranding of geoengineering techniques, and what we know as ocean fertilization is now being called ocean pasture or marine biomass regeneration, and even artificial whale poop. Similar to large tree plantations and its impacts on ecosystems and indigenous and rural communities, large monoculture of algae are a threat to the natural marine environment by occupying their niches, attracting diseases, and displacing biodiversity and the vital food chain that the natural algae are embedded in. It also threatens the sound ecosystems of artisanal algae cultivators and their livelihood. Scientific articles indicate the capacity to sequester carbon seems to be very poor, covering large parts of the seas and the bottom of the ocean with such massive amount of dead organic matters carries so much uncertainties and potential impacts. So just to zoom in on Article 6.4, which many of our colleagues have already explained also. Article 6 would replace the UN's Clean Development Mechanism from the Kyoto Protocol. The Clean Development Mechanism was intended to create and implement an international carbon market mechanism through which a company's emissions reduction in one country can be credited and sold to a company in another country. This means creating a supervisory body that can approve and register any emission reduction project even before it begins. So Article 6.4 has been criticized for allowing CDM, carbon emission reduction projects, to transition into the 6.4 system, and they can continue to use outdated methodologies until 2025 in some cases. Carbon Market Watch predicts that if all projects transitioned, the world would face the nightmare scenario of up to 2.8 billion of junk credits being issued. Geoengineering carbon dioxide removal techniques currently being considered in the frame of Article 6.4 include BECCS, direct air capture, enhanced weathering, ocean alkalinization, and fertilization, which are, again, all false solutions. The creation of new market mechanisms will only fuel the explosion of these false solutions. And in the latest Article 6.4 information notes, this note uses assumptions made by industries on the capacity of these carbon dioxide removal techniques. So of course, these are made to be marketable. But in fact, all carbon dioxide removal or carbon capture technologies around the world, including the large ones. Yeah.
We may need to be wrapping up. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try my best. It's just a few, one more topic after this. Sorry, I got a bit distracted there. All these technologies, including the large ones, have not functioned or grossly underperformed and are very expensive to deploy. So I will skip the next bullets. I think DCJ will share this with all of you. And just to say that Article 6 is quickly taking shape in the lead up to COP27, and we need to reject carbon markets and ensure that all false solutions in geoengineering are removed from the list of removal activities. So the last issue that I would like to highlight here is the ocean and climate change dialogue. So a decision was made at the UNFCCC COP26 to convene an annual Ocean and Climate Change Dialogue with the goal of strengthening ocean climate action for mitigation and adaptation. And a dialogue was held on June 15 at the climate conference in Bonn. And these photos here are available at the UNFCCC website. These are artist summaries of the different panels that happened during that dialogue. Insights and ideas from the June 15 dialogue contributed to the UN Ocean Conference in Portugal. And outcomes from this and succeeding ocean and climate change dialogues will feed not just into the UNFCCC negotiations, but also in the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and the International Maritime Organization. So in the coming COP27, the UNFCCC subsidiary body will present their summary of the dialogue that happened in June 15. Across all available summaries at the moment, there are concepts and proposals like a global Blue New Deal, blue bonds, blue carbon ecosystems inventory, nature compliant finance, nature as capital, decarbonizing the shipping sector, climate smart fisheries and aquaculture, bluing NDCs and NAPs as part of ocean climate action. And so from our perspective, the 2022 dialogue sounded the alarm on more carbon market mechanisms, digitalization and precision aquaculture, technological fixes, and fall solutions. And this new space, this ocean and climate dialogue, which will happen every year from now on, is a new space that we really need to closely watch in the coming years and hopefully try to influence. There were also demands to strengthen ocean climate action that is inclusive, collaborative, with proactive involvement of fisher folks and coastal communities. But an evident gap during this dialogue is the absence of local voices. The opening statements for each panel were given by top-level government and UN officials, technical and expert UN committee representatives, and surprise financing institutions. So to wrap this up, the UNFCCC is becoming more and more a space where geoengineering and fall solutions are really promoted and monetized. We urge everyone here and all our allies beyond to continue to closely monitor the different negotiations at COP27, including even the global stocktake and response measures. Because where there is capital and investments involved, we can expect geoengineering and fall solutions to always be put on the table. We know the fight is extremely hard, but we call for all of us to continue to collectively demand for deep emissions cut, deep systemic changes, just transitions, and real climate solutions, and push back against geoengineering and false solutions, not just in the UNFCCC, but also in other multilateral and international spaces.
Thank you very much, Nikki.
Oh, and lastly, if I may, please watch out for ETC Group's webinar on the last week of October, and this would discuss more details about geoengineering, specifically at COP27. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikki. This is a perfect, I mean, your presentation was perfect for the transition, because while we're talking about COP27, we cannot think in silos. COP27 and its results are connected to all several other processes, including what you mentioned related to oceans and including the Convention on Biological Diversity. For that, we have Doreen. Please go ahead, Doreen. We have limitations with our interpretation, and we're really out of our time. So I'm going to ask you, Doreen, please, and Osbert, to stick to the 10-minute time slot that we have, because we then run out of interpretation also. And thank you for your understanding. Please, Doreen, introduce yourself for those who don't know you yet. Go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I also have time limitations. So I think what I'm going to try to do is to be very brief and to share the slides and have people get in touch with me afterwards. So I will be far less than 10 minutes, I think. I'm a professor of global environmental politics at College of the Atlantic in the United States, and I also work with Suparna in the Climate, Land, Ambition, Rights Alliance. I work with Rachel Rose and Meena in the Equity and Ambition group, and I've been asked to just say a few things about the links between climate change and biodiversity. COP27, what's at stake, is not just about climate change. It's not just about COP27. That there, as Gadir says, there's links with the upcoming biodiversity COP. And we know there's these intersecting crises, right, of biodiversity and climate change. Loss of biodiversity contributes to climate change, and climate change exacerbates threats to biodiversity. And so we would assume that it makes sense to talk about climate change and biodiversity together. Of course, this is also a very great opportunity for all of the false solutions and the corporate capture and the big polluters that it provides also a great escape, right? And so while we might look at these climate change and biodiversity links in one way, those who want to continue burning fossil fuels, carrying on business as usual, also see it as a great opportunity. I'm just going to quickly go through slides to give you the highlights. There's obviously too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Whose responsibility is that? In the biodiversity context, there's a need to mobilize conservation and biodiversity finance. Whose responsibility is that? And of course, those for whom it's their responsibility, their answer is carbon markets, nature-based solutions. And so, you know, the simple relationships of nature absorbing carbon, carbon sequestration worth money, and this graphic probably encapsulates everything sort of in a nutshell. Shell is looking to plant a lot of trees. They assume that trees are the answer to, you know, the consumption of fossil fuels. They're going to sell gasoline for a few pennies more, and consumers can feel good that their carbon emissions are being soaked up. And of course, right in the center, you see a net zero energy emissions business. Shell thinks that by planting trees, it can become a net zero business, with all of the implications that Rachel Rose has talked about. So there are a couple of ways that these links are being made in the international negotiating space. At COP27, we'll see Article 6, and we'll see the Standing Committee on Finance talk about nature-based solutions. In COP15, a couple of weeks later in Montreal, we'll see the global biodiversity framework being used not to protect biodiversity, but to mobilize biodiversity to protect nature-based solutions for corporates and others to use to continue to, you know, quote unquote, offset their emissions, to use to sell on the Article 6 markets. And so that's sort of that's the capture of things. I have some slides with some text on them, both from the COP27 or COP26 and from the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I'd encourage you to look at those slides, because they show in the legal space how this bargain is happening, right? How communities, local communities, are supposed to protect nature. They're the global elites promising to mobilize money for that, not through their own money, but through the carbon market. Global elites will carry on emitting, and our nature becomes the solution for global elites. So that's a quick run through, and I hope I didn't go too quickly. you get the big picture, and I'm happy to be available to folks after by email. Gadir can link us up if you have any further questions. Thanks all.
Thank you so much, Doreen, for well, for actually reducing your presentation. I totally, the information you can provide is vital, although we're also very limited with time. But we will share the slides, and I hope that the people here now can at least interact in the chat with you a little bit with that opportunity. Or if you can also propose some triggering questions to the audience, that will be also good. And thank you so much for connecting and sharing your knowledge. Let's move on to another aspect related, because in all this frenzy of COP, the CBD COP, the climate change COP, there is also the perspective of the movements and of the regions. And I would like to invite Osver again. With our limited time, we have to be as brief as you can, and apologize for that, but to give us the perspective from a regional perspective on what are the key issues you see at this COP, or what is at stake at COP from a regional perspective. Please go ahead, Osver.
Hola, buenas, disculpen, estoy con, ahora sí. Gracias por la invitación. No sé si pudieran pasar la presentación. Voy a ser un poco breve porque ya creo que estamos con los tiempos. Unas cosas de reflexión, de actualización en América Latina, es que los impactos del cambio climático en nuestra región han aumentado enormemente, ¿no? Y se está sintiendo estos efectos principalmente en los ecosistemas que se están dañando, ¿no? Justamente la Organización Mundial de Meteorología ha mostrado un último informe de cómo está el efecto del cambio climático en nuestra región y cómo la población está sufriendo esos impactos. Por otro lado, los países de América Latina, en vez de avanzar sus compromisos respecto a la mitigación y adaptación, no se ha visto hasta el momento su implementación, ¿no? Su acción. Y esto se debe a la falta también de demostración por parte de los países del norte que no hacen su mejor tarea, ¿no? Y es por eso que tienen el problema de seguir aumentando más sus compromisos cuando no ve a la otra parte de los países del norte en hacer sus obligaciones. Nos preocupa también que algunos países de América Latina están también incluyendo dentro de sus políticas, dentro de sus compromisos climáticos, todo el tema de las soluciones falsas, ¿no? Como una manera también de evadir sus responsabilidades también internas y nacionales para reducir sus emisiones, ¿no? Gracias. Y por otro lado, parte de esta situación también tenemos el tema de los defensores, ambientales, ¿no? Que están siendo perseguidos, están siendo asesinados por defender su espacio, su territorio, su medio ambiente, ¿no? Y parte de esto es una preocupación en esta región, ¿no? Después la economía de nuestra región ha sido altamente vulnerada por la situación de esta crisis sanitaria que hemos tenido, y que ahora con esta crisis de guerra está afectando la economía de la gente pobre que recién está saliendo de esta situación de crisis sanitaria. El alza del petróleo, el alza de los alimentos ha afectado en algunos países, que tanto así que ha habido como movilizaciones, ¿no? Para exigir, ¿no? Que estos reclamos, ¿no? Están afectando la economía propia de la gente, ¿no? Por otro lado, la Asamblea de la ONU hace poco ha sido claro, los países de Latinoamérica que si no hay ambición, no van a aumentar más sus ambiciones climáticas. Si no hay financiamiento, tampoco no van a implementar sus planes de adaptación y mitigación. Y por otro lado, la exigencia de pérdidas de daños como una cuestión importante principalmente para los países que ya están siendo fuertemente vulnerables como el Caribe y que ya no tienen más dónde sacar más dinero interno con tantas seguidas de impactos climáticos que actualmente están sufriendo con los huracanes, ¿no? Yo creo que uno de los, si queremos hablar de otra región que ya está cerca y fuertemente impactada por el cambio climático, son los países caribeños, ¿no? Tenemos a los insulares, pero también tenemos a los países caribeños que están sufriendo cada año los efectos de los huracanes, ¿no? Y eso lo voy a demostrar en parte de mi film. La siguiente, por favor. Bueno, ¿cuáles son esos desafíos y oportunidades actuales en la región, ¿no? Exigir, creo que lo más importante, creo que la urgencia es exigir la transformación estructural respecto a la economía, ¿no? Ya esta economía que hoy tenemos ya no da más, ya no da más. Tenemos que pensar en otra economía con una mirada más ecológica, social y humana, ¿no? Esa es la perspectiva de los movimientos en América Latina, pensar en otra economía, ¿no? Y por otro lado, la necesidad de avanzar la recuperación hacia la naturaleza, porque hoy en día los ecosistemas importantes como la Amazonía, el océano, los glaciares, ¿no? Están en riesgo, ¿ya? Y eso puede afectar también la vida de la naturaleza, la vida de los territorios, ¿no? Por eso que parte de la preocupación de la región es cuidar lo que tenemos hasta el momento de la naturaleza, ¿no? Principalmente la Amazonía está en riesgo. Y en el Foro Social Paraamazónico que ha sido este año en Belén, hemos declarado la emergencia climática a la Amazonía por, por las políticas que ha hecho Bolsonaro negativas y que ha vulnerado la naturaleza, como también los territorios. Creo que aquí hay algunos amigos de Brasil que pueden comentar mejor, pero yo creo que eso es una preocupación para nuestra región. Por otro lado, el avance para la transición energética y ecológica desde los territorios es una importante manera de avanzar. Es lo que estamos tratando de los territorios, trabajar con ellos este cambio hacia la transición. La importancia de fortalecer un mecanismo importante que es Escazú, ¿no? Que es una forma de elevar la justicia ambiental, exigir a los países que rindan cuenta de sus acciones, ser más transparentes sus políticas ambientales y climáticas, que haya más participación, opinión pública, es lo que nosotros en la región de América Latina estamos haciendo con este acuerdo de Escazú. Y también Escazú es importante para defender a los perseguidos, a los maltratados, defensores ambientales que están luchando por cuidar su territorio, ¿no? La importancia de denunciar fuertemente las políticas que se han incluido dentro de los compromisos climáticos, las falsas soluciones, ¿no? Una manera, como dije, de evadir sus responsabilidades, de reducir sus emisiones, pero también de impulsar el cambio hacia la matriz energética y visibilizar las luchas territoriales, ¿no? Y las demandas que están haciendo los territorios, porque cuando nosotros hablamos que la COP, y todos nos enfocamos en la COP, no estamos viendo que la COP, en vez de no resolver los problemas, los territorios están sufriendo los impactos a no ver cambios en la COP para mantener el combustible bajo el suelo, o la minería que sigue explotando y contaminando. Entonces, yo creo que ahí es importante estar más cerca con los territorios. ¿Qué oportunidades hay, no? Esto hemos estado analizando. Creo que Colombia, con este nuevo gobierno como Petro, que ha invitado a los países a salvar la Amazonía y cambiar la narrativa del cambio climático, es una oportunidad importante. Creo que va a llevar una iniciativa a Colombia a la COP27 y que sería importante escuchar qué es lo que propone Colombia para ese cambio de la narrativa dentro de las COP. Chile avanzó con una propuesta para hacer cambios a su constitución, por una constitución más ecológica, pero no logró, pero dejó como una experiencia importante de cómo desde las bases hacer el esfuerzo de una participación, consulta, proceso de aporte a un cambio de la Constitución para traer la mirada más ecológica para el cambio de la economía, ¿no? Entonces nos ha dejado un legado Chile, esto para seguir pensando desde nuestros países cómo podemos cambiar nuestras constituciones donde está ahí metido todo el tema de las corporaciones, el extractivismo, el modelo económico capitalista, cómo cambiar nuestras constituciones. También hay toda una iniciativa de los litigios. Ya estamos, hay varios países que están pensando, o movimientos también, en aplicar los litigios a los países que están incumpliendo su compromiso climático, su compromiso político. Entonces, el próximo año hay iniciativas de demandar a algunos países de América Latina a que cumplan sus compromisos interponiendo un litigio. Por otro lado, para el 2023 se está pensando en lanzar la Asamblea por la Tierra, una manera de cambiar este sistema de las COP, porque las COP no están funcionando y las asambleas buscan un poco buscar otras alternativas, otra forma de pensar acciones y cómo resolver la crisis climática. Y porque ya se le dio mucho tiempo a las COPs, ¿ya? Y esto pasa por también que tenemos que dar respuesta a lo que varios de ustedes lo han dicho, los afectados climáticos directos, ¿no? Tenemos que dar respuesta y estar con ellos, ¿ya? Por eso que la Asamblea busca a llamar la atención a esos espacios internacionales que su tiempo se acabó y que tenemos que dar ese poder a los ciudadanos para cambiar esta forma de lo que hoy no queremos de esta crisis. Entonces, esa es la idea de la Asamblea por la Tierra.
Disculpa,
Y
Oscar,
por otro lado,
tiempo,
la importancia de avanzar el tratado de la... Sí, termino aquí. El tratado de no proliferación a los combustibles fósiles que está tomando mucha fuerza en América Latina. Ya hay ciudades, ya hay parlamentarios, hay iglesias que ya está impulsando esta iniciativa y creo que es una importante acción que debemos también tomar en cuenta. Y para avanzar, tenía unas filminas para que vean que el tiempo ya se acabó, se agotó las COP. Los efectos de cambio climático son cada vez más fuertes y yo creo que tenemos que, como manera de reflexión, creo que ya tenemos que cambiar nuestro accionar en nuestros espacios. No podemos seguir dándole vuelta, discutiendo lo mismo, sino que tenemos que estar más cerca con los afectados y luchar por su justicia de ellos. Entonces, la idea también es impulsar estos debates pensando desde la justicia climática, acompañando a los afectados directamente de los territorios. Gracias.
Gracias, Oscar. So thank you, Oscar, for providing us the regional view and for these other elements, I mean, that are somehow connected to COP in the terms of the disappointments of the COP and what they're not delivering and what these other movements are building together. I'm really aware of time. Apologize to all especially to our last panelists who did not enjoy as much time as we wanted. However, the information will be available and we will have other opportunities, hopefully with more time. I'm aware also that in the chat, Fatima is in the Zoom chat is sharing some of her thoughts and questions. And I reiterate that the contact and the slides and information will be shared so you can contact the panelists and get some more information and more interaction. Thank you all for being connected. Thank you to our interpreters. and the DCJ team for making it possible. And I hope this webinar was useful to all of you for our work, and let's hope and let's be connected because there's a lot to do in terms of our fights against big polluters, to really materialize these structural changes we've been talking about and we're still fighting for. Thank you all. Bye-bye.